Hi everyone, welcome to round 7 of Australs. My name is Joel, I'm the chair of the round. We're going to begin the round now. Can we have the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate? Here.
Before I begin, would it be all right for everyone in this room if I have my camera open? All right. Okay. I forgot to fix my timer. Hold on. Give me like a few seconds just to have it with me. All right. I'm first affirmative speaker. Again, no preferred pronouns. Feel free to use anything. I don't really have anything in mind right now. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. You have to understand when it comes to controversial policy areas, this looks like environment, criminal justice, where most of the people on the ground are the most at harm. We have to understand then why having touch or having citizen assemblies are going to be the most important part in trying to ensure that we're able to cater to the most of the people, right? Before that, let's talk about a few nuances that are going to be important in this round. This looks like two things. We have to characterize what controversial issues are, and two, what do we necessarily mean when we say a widespread use, right? When we say controversial issues, again, as I've mentioned, these are all like policy areas, or these are all matters that already affect usually the people on the ground. This looks like environments where people that are from the poorer areas, or the people that are actually just parts of the normal society, feeling the ones in the brunt. This excludes like people from like the top 1%, usually people from like the Senate who are powerful, as we can assume, right? This means then that we have to understand like why their involvement is probably the most of value at this time. Seems that the Adj got disconnected or off cam. All right, I'll just continue if that's okay.
Yeah, for chair, the policy is we wait 5 minutes. So yeah.
All right. It's okay. So I'll just count down then continue. All right. Okay. Going to start in 3, 2, 1. Even if negative comes to say that there might have some sort of societal involvement under their side, why a full citizen assembly will still be the most appropriate when it comes to creating a law reform, for example, in these controversial policy areas. What does it mean when we say widespread use, right? This looks like, for example, certain countries will have, or most countries then, will have to employ this, or will have to understand then, or to see that, okay, we're going to be able to use this as an option for us to have or to determine what direction do we have to move, or what direction are we going to move when it comes to controversial policy areas. Because you have to understand, we talk about controversial policy areas, these are probably very sensitive matters. Things that you have to understand will probably have take high precedence. We're talking about how to proceed further. One that involves a lot more a lot more thinking, and a lot more just it's not just a, oh, let's just do this, it's a yes or no vote and then we do it, for example, that, right? So about then, what does our model look like? We have to point out the nuance right now will only exist in controversial issues. For those that are outside that scope, obviously we're not going to deploy citizen assemblies because we'd rather have that already to senators and congressmen, right? This looks like we're going to have democratically chosen citizens. How does that look like? This looks like this is going to be chosen from a public database of the citizens. There's a collective, or there's an information node where we're able to randomly pick these people, right? It also looks like for people to be qualified to even be chosen, they have to be at the very least age of minority. It's a valid prong because this is the age, mostly like 18 or 21 or whatnot, where society has a consensus that they are considered an adult, and one that they already have at least a sufficient amount of knowledge when it comes to certain issues of society, right? Once they have been chosen, two things are coming to mind then. One, two things will probably likely to happen. One, they'll be provided with all necessary information. This looks like they'll be given statistics, historical records. They'll be given copies of the Constitution to know what can be constitutionally plausible, and also understand what their most important issues that they have to think about when we're making that law, when they're making that legislation, right? And two, to be allowed to ask questions. Why it's important for us to have that specialist in round, right? Because negative might say that, oh, they're probably not going to have that specialist knowledge, for example. They're probably going to be too detached. Again, because there's already a specialist involved, it's probably already going to mitigate that part, right? Because if they have questions, they're also likely to be everyone involved. It's most likely just going to be a logistical problem if negative that would like to run that case. Also like to say that when we say remain independent, it looks like, for example, each individual will have the personal state chaperone, or this looks like to mitigate outside influences. So you have to understand when you're a state, or when you're a congressman, or when you're a senator, you're most likely going to be influenced by outside people, like companies who want to lobby for certain things. Because most of the time, when it comes to state policies made by these people on, like, in court, they're most likely going to be influenced, or most likely going to rely on lobbying. It's going to be important then in making sure there's no influence of that. And we're only going to talk about the very main important part of the matter. What's the burden then? We have two burdens. First is to prove to you the widespread use of citizen assemblies lead to better laws that cater to the most number of people, again, which are most likely the citizens themselves. And two, the status quo of leaving policymakers up to the senators and congressmen are faulty, and which is why we need to convert to citizen assemblies. First argument then, why has status quo failed? What's the premise here? As of currently right now, we have to understand that the congressmen and senators are faulty or unreliable decision makers, especially when it comes when they've already detached themselves from the majority of society, who have who have to shoulder the brunt of all of these controversial policy issues, right? Let's characterize how does it look like with the senators. This looks like two things. One, the election of their power are mostly born of dirty power. Even if there are some that don't, they bite into campaigning to make them look better, to make them look polished. This means that the choices that people have made are not a fully informed one, that they can fully represent the harms that the congressman probably used as a tactic to say that they can better represent the people on the ground. The people you elect then are also probably most likely part of the dominant class, meaning you also have fewer diversity. What does this mean? On the converse, you have higher chance to choose the median case. We're not saying that picking a rich individual is not impossible, but you have a greater population of those in the median, of like the middle class or the lower class, right? Meaning that we're able to cater to their interests, probably things that only they will understand when it comes to controversial policy issues. Again, even if you say that some of these politicians have been in the shoes of these people, most likely they've already separated themselves from the ground in the wild. Also, this is pretty much unlikely to even happen in the first place, as politics is a battle of privilege and power anyway. The only way you get diversity on negative is a long unfair battle of who gets to be more beautiful to the eyes of the people. At least on this side, we're able to have a better diversity and a better chance at that. We're trying to think about what is going to cater to the most of society. Mostly, they're out of the heavy harms of the controversial issues. Why is this important? This looks like, for example, when it comes to controversial policy issues that we're talking about, they have safety nets that are isolated from all the brunt. This looks like, for example, when you're already suffering from disasters like typhoons or whatnot, they're probably in the high place that is away from all of that danger and away from all of that ugliness, right? So what's going to happen then, because they're not involved in the brunt, they're most likely going to see these issues in a bird's eye view. They're outside of the people that you have to cater to. Even if they're able to involve some level of societal involvement under negative, they'll not be able to fully flesh it out in comparison to how citizen assemblies are able to fully maximize that level of involvement, right? Conversely, then, citizens, why do these controversial policies need a citizen touch then? This looks like, on the converse, citizens are most likely to take this seriously. It's a rare opportunity of the state. So they're able to understand that, for example, oh, this is a responsibility that I have to do. I'm taking the responsibility of the whole society, people who have suffered along with me. It's different from when you're a senator or a congressman, where you're already outside that and you understand that your power is already established and is already safe at the most part, where outside influence might not necessarily remove you from that position, right? And it's going to be longer, right? Meaning that they don't have that sense of urgency. Also, then there's also have to understand there's no societal consensus on what to do. It's just like when it comes to environment issues, we don't know if we're going to continue going green or if we're going to keep some sort of coal plants or whatnot because it benefits us. The issues with having only senators and congressmen then is because they're probably going to be super detached. And with that, proud to propose things.
All right. All right, thanks. Can we have the first negative speaker to introduce the case for the NEC team here?
I can be seen and heard, right? Oh yeah, just reminding again, I don't consent to being recorded. Rough night last night.
All right, thank you very much. First negative speaker, can we invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the case for the affirming team?
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There's a tension in the case of side negative because first negative says that they're fine with referendums, but they're not fine when citizens make decisions in controversial policy areas. This is a tension because when do we hold referenda usually? It's when this is a very controversial topic. The reason why we held a referenda for Brexit was that there's no that like senators and congressmen were not able to reach a decision on their own because it's a very controversial topic. The population is divided on whether we ought to leave like the EU or not. It's the same thing. So the same intuition applies in controversial policy areas like climate change and criminal law. We don't have a universal consensus in society that the way we should address climate change should be to full on green transition, or like we should just scale down back on our consumption and still maintain some coal plants, etc., etc. So we think that insofar as they're fine with the referendum, which is usually done in situations where a certain topic is controversial, we think that the controversial policy areas to really to defend inside affirmative still applies. But secondly, they cannot just defend their entire case by saying, principle of voting, you voted these people into power. Note that we're not against this principle. In fact, we're fine with senators and congressmen making legislation on behalf of their citizens when it comes to non-controversial policy areas. So things like national security, when you have an invading country and you have to conscript people or something, or when it comes to economic policies that people are generally less concerned with, it's less controversial. We're fine with upholding the principle of voting in this instance. So we're not against the principle of voting. We're just saying that there are instances where this principle has to be relaxed. The first question I'd like to ask is, will citizens make rational decisions? The first thing that you heard from side negative was that they will not be able to absorb the information that you give meaningfully. If that's the one of their main problems is that people will not be able to understand the information that we give them. Know that first affirmative already gave you numerous mechanisms on how we can bridge this knowledge gap. First, we can probably hire development communicators to dumb down the language of scientific information so that people are able to understand them. Or we could probably use infographics instead of like text to send their message across when we notice that a lot of the candidates are visual learners and textual learners and things like that. We're saying that if there is a knowledge gap, the solution would be to bridge this knowledge gap. But secondly, if that's their problem, that average citizens cannot digest information probably, it would even suggest that the same problem happens on their side. We beg to differ. Politicians are also not scientists. Politicians are also, in the vast majority of instances, not professionals. Most oftentimes, there are instances where politicians are just elected into power because of nepotism. Politicians are elected into power because they're charismatic, because they have a good voice, etc., etc. So it's unclear why, if the problem is scientific, the inability to digest complex information, the same problem happens on their side as well. They don't provide any reason why these people would make use of the scientific information well as well. Second thing, they talk about biases. We think that biases at best are asymmetric harm, because on both sides there will be bigoted Republicans, bigoted Republicans on our side, there will be bigoted Republicans as well. So it's almost symmetric. But third thing I would like to address under the issue of rationality is the idea of where are individuals more detached from reality. The first thing that you have to notice that this is a reality on both sides. There is a possibility that on their side there will be politicians who are detached. On our side, from the randomly selected individuals, there will be detached individuals as well. But we have to weigh this on the extent of detachment from reality. We say that politicians, compared to like random selected groups of people, are structurally more detached from reality. One, it is often the rich who are elected in seats of power because they have the money to be able to pay off good advertising campaigns, etc., etc. They have the money to fund misinformation networks and fake news and do smear campaigns against their own opponents. So it's more likely the rich who are elected to power. Second, they say it is this is even affirmed by the analysis that came from First Negative, that we should not vote average people into power. So we can reasonably assume that the politicians on their side are on balance the rich, are on balance privileged, who are more detached from reality. So in terms of where individuals more like to make irrational decisions, we would say it's on their side, because while they provide symmetric characterizations, they don't prove well enough how these symmetric harms are mitigated on their side. Um, but then let's first negative said that politicians have an incentive to listen because they want to be re-elected. Fair enough. We would say that even if they do listen, there are exclusive benefits to the idea of participatory deliberation. It is the feeling of being included in decision making when it comes to controversial policy making that makes people trust more in the system. The feeling is more direct. Conversely, even if like you do reach a consensus within the Senate and within the Congress with regards to these controversial policy areas, there will be always some degree of mistrust and suspicion from the people, because they would say that, oh, it's just a matter of politicking, the Republicans just mowed over the liberals as well, etc., etc. On our side, once you reach a decision, people are less likely to question it because they know that it has come from the voice of the masses. Why do we want to do this in controversial policy areas most specifically? We think that these are areas of public policy that people take most seriously, i.e. this directly linked to your survival. These are tied to things like culture and religion, as opposed to non-controversial things like national security and employment. Let's now then address some of the harms that came from side negative. The first thing they said is that, well, people are short-sighted. They will prioritize their immediate needs. The first response I have to this is, why is this bad? I think we just have a long-term bias as a society. We think even if these are short-term needs, these are legitimate needs as well, because they have a direct relationship to their survival. So you can't say to a mother of 3 living near the lake that they shouldn't prioritize their short-term needs of surviving when it comes to flooding, because that's directly linked to their survival, right? We would even suggest that fulfillment of short-term needs determine individual survivability in the long run. So if they want to say that we have to be long-termist when we create policies, the prerequisite for people to appreciate long-termist policies in the first place is, A, if they are alive to begin with, so you need to prioritize short-term needs first. But secondly, people will only appreciate those things when you already fulfill their short-term needs, i.e. they're more comfortable entertaining such topics. The second harm that they say is that, well, the deliberation is going to take a long time. I don't know why this is going to be bad. I would even suggest that it's justified because it's a controversial topic, so you need to reach a close approximation of decision, which is why you even if it takes a long time, it's good because it's probably for the best. What are the outcomes if it's a short decision making, which is probably the counterfactual of side opposition? It says that it's going to be an inaccurate decision, or B, worst case, there's going to be public outcry, or worst case, you reverse the law entirely because people don't like the result. Um, because people don't like the result. The last verse from second affirmative. We're not saying that the world on our side is absolutely representative. Obviously, debates are won on extents. We would suggest that if they have 50 politicians dictating the future of a country when it comes to controversial policy issues, that is less preferable to the 150 randomly selected individuals on our side, because probably by degrees that's more representative because you have a larger sample size, right? Larger sample size, right? But we also prove that the demographic of the candidates that we're more likely to get are people who don't just belong to the upper 1% of society. We're more likely to gravitate towards the median case in choosing our sample size. Very proud to propose things.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the Second negative speaker to advance the case coming from the negative side. Here.
Sorry, can I just have like 10 seconds? All right, just checking if I'm visible and audible. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in a bit. Just give me 1 second. What the fuck? Sorry, just give me 1 second. Chat, can you copy paste the link to my doc? Put it into WhatsApp group. Sorry guys, just give me 1 second. I can't find my prep notes on this laptop. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Some technical difficulty. Online debating isn't best. No preferred gender pronouns. I'll start my speech in a bit. My quick observation of side affirmative is the severe lack of nuance. The characterization of voters in their world is similar to a homogeny where there are no differing opinions and clash in perception, especially when it comes to controversial issues that are incredibly polarizing. Controversial issues like how do we solve the Flint water crisis? Controversial issues like how do we solve police brutality? I don't think that the best decision would be to leave the solution or coming up with solutions to these controversial issues in the hands of unprofessional, unknowledgeable, and ignorant everyday people. I would argue that we take this debate in the side of negative by that metric already. But what have we said thus far that have already won this debate? A couple of responses. On the point of insufficient advice, the pushback coming from side affirmative now is that they said, oh, but people are not that dumb. They can understand infographics. We can make things interesting for them. I'm sorry, but firstly, these people are not preschoolers. If the fact that you have to dumb things down like complex policy making to an infographic, I would argue that that's a disservice to the entire framework of policy making to begin with, but it's also an adorable attempt by them to say like politicians are not professionals and try to wash off this issue and say, well, politicians might be detached too. And the example that they cited to prove why politicians might be detached is because people who are rich get elected into seats of power by buying billboards and funding their marketing campaigns. Just firstly, I would say that they're quite attached if they know what they need to do to fund their campaigns so that people vote for them. But jokes aside, these are two fucking different issues, right? Politicians who do smear campaigns doesn't prove that they will be detached when making policies. I would say, yeah, there is a degree of detachment within politicians in terms of what they represent. Do they represent what truly the people want? Do they represent the national consensus? But I would argue people who have a bias, people who are not within that field itself, people who you can't hold accountable will be more likely to be detached, right? The second issue then is on the decision making of people. They say it's okay for people to be short-termist because we have a long-term bias in society. Yeah, that decision would be okay if I was choosing what fucking pizza to have for dinner, not when I'm deciding policy for like 7 million people in my country. I think there needs to be a balance of short-termist incentive and long-termist solutions so that we can have the best of both worlds. Because in your world, if you truly say you fight for the people and fight for representation for them, your short-termist solution to extreme poverty in some ghetto in New York City is going to be to give them immediate welfare. But that's not what they need. They need things like housing. They need things like how we can increase accessibility to education. I'm unlikely to believe, given that there is a lack of proof that we can get this form of long-term form of solutions, and also the fact that second affirmative already proved that these people are going to be short-termist in nature, I would argue that you're unlikely to get this degree of change, especially when dealing with controversial issues that are cyclical in nature, that take a long time to deconstruct and to remove all the fucking problems that have to do with this controversial issue, I think we need to have a balance in both worlds. They have conceded that it's only short-termist in their world, they lose out. But I would also say, they say that 150 people deciding is more democratic than 50 senators that vote for you. Those 50 fucking senators were voted in by their constituencies that trusted in them, the constituencies that turned out in record number, turned out on record numbers on election day. These are the people that entrusted this particular politician in making these decisions for them in the first place, which is why our principle was important. Because we said, when you vote in a politician and a politician goes into power, you are directly signing off your rights to make decisions to that politician. And they said that and that is why we are okay with things like parliamentary discussions and referendums, right? But they tried to have a gotcha moment with us when they said, oh, the tension is referendum, because if you're okay with referendums, then we also should be okay with this. That's my exact fucking question. Why not just use referendums in your world, right? Because I think we clearly proved in the principle that people, as a consensus, can decide the direction of the country based on who they're voting for, i.e. liberal or like conservative, but they don't decide the specific policies that take place within that process of change. So for example, if I'm a liberal government turning into a conservative government, you can't decide how that particular process takes place, but you decide that overall direction. I think that's what referendums are for. I don't understand why we can't have it in your world as well, right? As opposed to this particular policy. But onto our argument then, on the question in my speech on why trust is necessary in a democracy. Affirmative says there's always a degree of mistrust, so it's symmetrical in both worlds. But democracy functions on the trust of the people, trust in the process, trust in the decisions that are made, trusting in the outcome of discussions and debates that are held in Parliament and in the House of Congress. Why is there a lack of trust in their world? Firstly, they don't prove that these discussions are going to be transparent. Like, are these discussions going to be live streamed on C-SPAN or whatever for people to watch? I don't think so. But because of this, people will assume things like the government being involved in these discussions or influencing outcomes, people selected on the basis of bias to be included in these discussions. But what do you do when people are unhappy with the outcome of these discussions, right? The problem then isn't just transparency. The problem then is a political apathy to the democratic process. I think this is especially important, especially when the group that is primarily affected by controversial issues are minority groups, right? For example, police brutality and how some solutions suggested is to increase funding for the police. If these policies are passed, it's more likely that the minorities will feel that the government doesn't care about them, further locking out more vulnerable groups. I think we win on that metric as well. But onto our practical then, and we proved why this is worse off for policy making. Our practical here was time. As we've proven in the principle, these discussions are likely to be fruitful and like productive or even democratic, right? And they're more likely to take a much longer time than Parliament and Congress. Why is this the case? Firstly, very intuitively, the fact that there is now an additional step before Parliament and Congress means that it will intuitively take a longer time. But discussions in Parliament are likely to be messy. Why is this the case? Because it's difficult for politicians to represent their constituencies. For example, if I was a politician and I was fighting for a specific issue on a specific solution for the people of my constituency, I've been fighting for this fucking issue for my entire political career. But now, just because 10 people had a discussion in a small room, which I have no idea about, that means Donald Trump can then cite this discussion as a reason as to why my solution won't pass and why my solution is undemocratic. I would argue that it's much worse for people within these particular areas who have no say whatsoever when you start having these discussions, because it's so easy for other politicians to use this particular discussion or the outcome of these discussions as the reason as to why the decisions probably that this politician wants to have in their constituency is one that is democratic. I think it's even worse out than, even without this extra step, parliamentary discussions are going to be incredibly messy. The impact to this impact is that it's undemocratic, right? Because now I, as a politician who is elected by my constituency, cannot truly represent the wants and needs of my people. The comparative here is simple. Why is policy making, especially when it comes to controversial issues, better on our side? Firstly, on the point of politicians. Understand that politicians have to read actual policies crafted by specialists rather than crafted on their own subject, on their own opinions to understand complex concepts. That means if you want to say that there's a degree of detachment in both worlds, I would argue politicians who have resources like funding and resources like access to specialist information and access to advanced right? It's not just advice that you can tune out to because you haven't been in the field. It's advice that you constantly listen to every day, and you know that you have to weigh this as something that's important. I would argue that same psyche is unlikely to be existent in the minds of people. But secondly, on accountability, and this is our Mac to counter politicians being shit. Yes, politicians can be shit. They can be detached, they can be horrible, but the fact that we have an additional level of accountability to individual politicians where we can call them out, where we can protest against our government, where we can literally vote them out, are all accountability measures that prove why there is some level of recourse if these politicians end up being stupid. But there's nothing for this citizens' assembly. How are you going to call out these people within this particular group who have discussions behind closed doors, or even with fucking open doors? I don't think it matters, because there's no way you can call out a group of people that you didn't vote in the first place. There is no recourse on their side of the house. Accountability on our side is an exclusive mechanism, because for the affirmative's benefits to materialize, Parliament needs to follow the policy made by the Assembly to a large degree. I think it's very little accountability then. But accountability is extremely important, because there must be corrective mechanisms, especially for policy made from controversial issues, especially when policies are likely to be hit or miss at the first time when you're crafting this policy. I think the trial and error phase is one is likely to be successful when it's done by people like politicians and their experts, right? But also we get more experience in our, because it's much faster in terms of policy making when we talk about controversial issues, but also the magnitude of the mandate, where we have 150 people versus 50 senators. I would argue that 50 senators that 7 million people voted in is more democratic. They lose this debate.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the third affirming speaker to begin their speech? I'll pause the recording here. Can I just check? Yeah. We thank the third affirming speaker for that speech. Can we have the third negative speaker to end the constructive segment of the debate before the reply segment begins? Here.
All right. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two parts to my speech. The first, which side upholds democracy better, and the second, which side crafts better policies for controversial issues. On the first issue, F's contention is that the people are now directly involved in democracy. I think I definitely have two responses to this. The first is that we already have this status quo through referendums, through people being invited to select committees to be able to share their insights in policy making, from parliament, members of parliament going down to the ground, especially during campaigning period, getting people's insight in views, and then people being able to cast their ballots in like during voting and then be involved in democracy. So I think all of these mechanisms already show that people are involved in policy. There's no explanation on affirmative as to why this extra step is one that is necessary, or one that breaks the disillusionment of people that people have towards democracy that affirmative contents already exists. And the second thing I want to note is that this isn't really a tension in our case. Obviously, referendums are completely fine because it doesn't require specialist information. It takes into account the people's view on whether a law should be repealed or law should be added. For example, the Ireland's, was it Scotland or Ireland that had the referendum on abortion laws, where a majority of people decided that they want to fully legalize abortion. We think all that is fine. It doesn't require specialist information. It's where in which you get the input from people. All that's completely fine, not tension. Second response, I think this only benefits people that are chosen for these assemblies, right? So this rebuttal necessarily means that we diminish the magnitude of benefit that affirmative contents exist, because note that only the people that are selected for these committees, for these assemblies, are the ones that are going to be directly involved in democracy. And I think added with the argument that we've talked to you about, how these people now have an undue influence in policy making, how it is unfair that a random group of people, and note that random doesn't always mean fair or representative, which is the only mechanism that affirmative relies upon to ensure that this committee is one that is fair, it would result in the largest number of people feeling included in democracy. But I would flip this argument then and argue that this excludes people outside of these assemblies, and this takes out their benefit benefit of people feeling satisfied with democracy, or people following policy recommendations made by this assembly. I'd argue that there's now an outgroup of people that feel like they didn't have the chance to be selected by this committee, especially if they feel that it is done by a random selection. They feel like now a group of people who have zero say over, it's now deciding policy for my country. I don't know why I should listen to this policy. I don't know why I should feel more trust in a system that continuously fucks me over. All of this just means that the benefit, even if it exists, is extremely limited to the number of people that were lucky enough to be chosen for this assembly. And secondly, it comes at the cost of a larger number of people feeling worse off, feeling like they have been excluded directly from democracy making. What is the comparative then? Our principle of democracy is extremely simple. You have a mandate in which your members of parliament were voted in by a majority of your people within the constituencies. These are the people that are not necessarily experts, but they literally read out the policies that their experts or their advisors make for them. It doesn't require the average lay person to understand complex policies. We also argued why this is necessarily a better form of democracy, because you're able to hold them accountable, because these are people that are voted in, not a random group of people that are selected. Two metrics for you to consider, Judge. The first, the magnitude that affirmative talks about. Because as I've proven earlier, a lot of their benefits applies to the small number of people that were chosen for these assemblies. Even if affirmative argues that another 150 people can be chosen for another controversial issue, I'd argue that that doesn't really translate to a larger number of people feeling involved in democracy, but rather just that X number of people within a particular period of time having a say in democracy, compared to outside of the House, where the mandate remains equal, right? Where you had your chance to vote in elections, and you then ensured that your member of parliament is supposed to follow the mandate of your constituency. But secondly, I think the extent of our benefits are better, because we have a lot of the shared benefits, right? People feeling involved in democracy, people at least ensuring that they have their insights. But we have this to a greater extent, and we don't give an undue amount of power to a random group of people that are selected. I think secondly, then, we at least allow for some type of or at least a scale of vulnerable people being protected, because we've given you reasons to suggest as to why, if a country moves toward a particular ideology, is what we see in the United States, where the country shifts continuously between liberal and conservative ideologies. I'd argue that a random selection doesn't always mean a proportionate selection of what is that ideology within that particular country. So all of this just means that our principle of democracy is one that follows whatever the mandate the particular that the citizens of that country want at that time and have consented to at that time. Even if it is a minority of people that probably wanted conservative ideologies but didn't get a conservative prime minister or president, this is a minority of people as compared to your select assemblies or your citizen assemblies that have an undue influence, or at least likely to be an asymmetry of power when it comes to that. Second part of my speech: which side crafts better policies for controversial issues? Affirmative's premise that they rely upon for all of their benefits is that the citizen assembly be more representative of the people. I think firstly, this is symmetrical to some extent. I think we've seen in a lot of instances, especially in liberal democracies, and I'm arguing that, at least assuming this is where this debate is happening, is where in which we see a lot of representation of a large spectrum of people within democracies. I argue that this doesn't always apply to a random selection of people, because not random doesn't always mean proportionate, which is, I guess, what affirmative assumes random to be. Random could be 5 white rich men within your conservative assembly, and they were lucky enough to be chosen, versus your other 5 who are, from different ideologies and backgrounds. I'd argue then that their mechanism of representation doesn't always work out. The second response then, I think their representation or their ability or their benefit of representation only activates at the point at which you are able to understand and apply specialized knowledge to the best extent. Third affirmative says that they are dismissing, or at least dismissive to how people are able to understand information, and they accepted that probably these people are preschoolers, but they can absorb information. That is fine, but I argue that your average citizen does not have the bias training necessary, does not have the ability to understand complex nuance when it comes to controversial issues. And the importance of this rebuttal is that this comes at an important juncture of a nation's history, where in which you have a very divisive issue or a very urgent issue that needs to be settled, but you now have to dumb down your information, or at the very least this takes a large amount of time. We've argued why that time is one that harms your country to a greater extent. Third response, I think in the instance in which you have freedom from accountability, and know that affirmative doesn't prove why you have accountability for this citizens' assembly, it's more likely that you're able to hold more controversial, divisive opinions, which is why we see that in a majority of liberal democracies, it's not politicians that are the most extreme, although there are probably a few fringe politicians that are the worst. But we see a large number of people that are on the ground that hold a lot of divisive opinions and controversial opinions because they're not accountable to a larger group of people that have to vote them in. All this just means that it's very likely that your people are holding extremely controversial, divisive, and dismissive opinions that don't really cater to the best extent of people. Let's look at their benefits then. Note firstly, panel, that a lot of their benefits can be achieved on our side. If you want people to feel more involved, get referendums. If you want more insight of the personal impact that a law has on you, you have select hearing committees that invite people from the community. But the problem is that their arguments are extremely general and there's not really proven as to why their benefits add anything extra to what we already have in status quo. Let's look at our comparative then. I think we've argued to you quite to a large extent as to why we get more experience when it comes to policy making and why that is particularly important and why that is a winning metric in this debate. Because if they argue that they want policy making for urgent issues, we've given you reasons as to why this needs urgency, especially when it comes to hearing this law in parliament, etc. And secondly, we've given you why this, to a larger extent, is able to be more better policies because it takes into account specialist information that doesn't require the average layperson to understand. For all these reasons, vote negative.
All right, thanks. Can we have the negatives reply speaker?
Okay, hello. There are two parts to my reply speech. Firstly, on two technical flaws, which I think already warrant a loss for side affirmative, and then ultimately onto two issues in this debate that I think further prove why side negative definitely wins this debate today. Two technical flaws then. Number one, they're incredibly unnuanced. I think the fact that they never once characterized voters as having differing forms of opinions, that even if they were more involved in the particular issue or they were more connected to this particular controversial issue, that doesn't mean that they're going to come up with an outcome that is homogeneous, right? And I think that's the problem inside of affirmative, because lack of this contextualization and lack of this nuance, I don't think there's an accurate depiction of voters in their side, which means that the decisions and outcomes that they claim in terms of benefits, even if it's just like auxiliary benefits, like additional insight or whatever, because I don't think I get a specific benefit from their side either, I don't think can fly because you don't accurately characterize voters and how they look like and how the particular democratic system in these countries look like and what the frameworks look like. But secondly, none of the things that they claim are exclusive. Things like insight into the democratic process, things like increasing political awareness and things like that are things that we can get in our side too, through like, I don't know, political like education and helping people understand what is it that they're voting for, what are issues that are important to them, and like helping people understand how the democratic process works. I don't think we need people directly involved in the decision-making process and coming up with solutions for these things to be exclusive. I think we can co-opt a lot of these benefits in our world as well. Onto two issues then in my speech. Number one, which side has a better form of democracy? And secondly, why the decision-making process in their world will suck. Onto the which side has better form of democracy then. What do we say? Three parts to our principle. Number one, on voting, the fact that when you vote a politician in, you're directly signing off your rights to craft policies to them. What you have the decision to make is the direction of the country in terms of whether you want it to be more liberal or conservative, or if you want your country to leave, I don't know, an economic bloc like Brexit. I think that's when you can decide on the direction of the country, not specific solutions that people come up with. I think Catherine was quite clear in deconstructing why this is so important and why referendums are something that we're okay with. They tried to say that it's a tension. I think that's resolved. Number two, then, on national consensus, we also proved that when a particular government is voted into power, they represent the ideologies of its citizens in a consensus, which means that if America votes conservative and Donald Trump gets into power, I think it's fair to hypothesize that the majority of people within America would want to vote conservative and would hold conservative perceptions, opinions, and ideologies, which means that the randomness or the random nature of this selection in which you claim is random isn't so random at all. Because if I choose random from a group of people in a particular constituency or like across the nation or whatever, I'm more likely to get conservatives. That is if you want to claim the selection process isn't so random and you would determine that there is a proportion. I would argue that governments are more likely to abuse this then, but it's no longer for arguments onto accountability then. The fact that we can get accountability measures much better in our world in terms of how we hold our politicians accountable, that we can call them out, the fact that they're in a position of power, we can vote them out in the next election, we can protest. But the fact that this group of people aren't tied to a specific political party or tied to a specific political ideology because they would want to claim they're neutral, there is no pushback that we get to this group of people. There is no way that we can hold these people accountable. There is no way we can ask them to redo these discussions, because based on these discussions, parliaments are already going to have like a say in it. But they said that the reason why the current status quo is undemocratic is because 50 senators are making the decision for like the entire country. We proved why. The senator was probably voted in on a national consensus. That's how politicians get into power, which means you probably have more people voting for this politician as opposed to people being involved in this discussion. Which means even if you take away the ability of one particular senator to voice out their solutions and to voice out their opinions based on what their constituency wants, that's already undemocratic, because you're locking out the opinions of millions of people or like thousands of people who probably voted these particular politicians in. Their metric to this was that politicians are detached. I think we proved particularly why politicians there's detachment in both worlds, but why politicians are unlikely to be detached because they are answerable to the people. There has to be some level of attachment. But secondly, then I think we proved why the decision-making process was stuck in their world in terms of time, because they're likely to be a clash of opinions and slow in decision-making process. In terms of minorities, where it causes political apathy amongst minorities who are primarily affected by things like controversial issues like police brutality. I think we protect all these people. We get trust in the democratic process. We have experience. We protect vulnerable groups.
All right. Thanks. Can we have the affirmatives reply speaker here?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me set up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I want to point out two tensions in the case of negative. The first is on whether citizens can digest information well. At first, neg, they say that they're not equipped to understand, therefore they're unreliable. But come second neg, they say we're belittling these people because we would dumb down scientific knowledge. This means that they have to choose which characterization they side with. If you believe first neg, we gave reasons to bridge the knowledge gap. But if you believe it with second, negative, they make our burden actually lighter, because they also agree that people are not dumb; they're able to make good use of this information. The second thing is when they conceded that referendum is valid. They say that we also already have referendum in status quo, that therefore that's enough. There are two implications of this concession. The first is all of their harms on citizens' short-sightedness that they repeatedly pushed on our side also applies to referenda as well, assuming that referenda are also built by citizens. Secondly, if they're fine with referenda, then citizens' assemblies are also fine by their logic, assuming they are activated in times of controversy. Note that the conclusion of this first discussion is they operate on shifty characterizations. A shifty characterization means an inconsistent frame. The second question is, which side is more democratic? Negative said that you voted them, they make decisions, ergo it's automatically democratic. Know that they cannot argue for the electoral process sake, right? They have to explain what's going to be effectively manifested here. But secondly, note that the only time this argument flies is if they're able to prove that politicians are preferable when it comes to controversial policies, that they're best actors to arbitrate on behalf of people's decision making. We gave you numerous structural reasons why that's not the case. First, the trend of politicians being part of the 1% or the rich because they're the ones who are able to buy themselves into power. The second, the way these people were voted is not reliable 100% of the time because they use coercive mechanisms to get there, like advertisements and campaigns. Opposition web says randomness does not equate to democratic. Well, being elected through advertisements and dirty politicking that sugarcoat your image isn't fully democratic either. We would say that randomness is better because all people in society have equal chances of being part of the assembly compared to their side where certain actors have more chances chances of being elected into power because of their status, because of their power, etc. But the most damning analysis coming from Neg is when first Neg said that politicians have an incentive to listen to their people. This means that on their side, it is also the voice of the people who determines the direction of controversial policies. So they don't really give a mutually exclusive model. They just make politicians the middleman because at the end of the day, politicians will listen to the people, assume that politicians want to be in the side of the citizens' favor. They want to listen to them and make their opinions their decision points, right? But lastly, so this means that we don't really operate on two different things. We just have a middleman there like politicians. We both rely on the citizens' decision making. Second, they say that we assume people are homogeneous in nature. Check your notes. We didn't say that. In fact, we agree that people have different ideologies that exist on both sides. But we say we're better because people are more likely to agree on the outcome, i.e., not have feelings of mistrust and suspicion because of the feeling of being directly included in the process. Not that Negative wasn't able to explain why, even in the best form of like politicians' intentions, people will not question their decision making. People will not feel any mistrust because they're not directly included in the decision making. The saving grace of Negative is perhaps their issue on accountability, but it is not enough for them to win because the premise of accountability is that the people who made legislation on a controversial policy will receive public outcry and dissatisfaction when they make errors. Note that they have to prove first, note that affirmative already explained why dissatisfaction is unlikely or less likely given the feelings generated by being included in decision making. But secondly, feelings of dissatisfaction are more likely on their side, which is presumably where you'll need more accountability. This means that they're just cleaning up a problem they made in the first place. Very proud to
Hi everyone, welcome back to the round. Thank you for that debate. So as a piece of general comment to the teams moving forward on debates about democratic reforms, these sorts of debates are really about a lot more weighing out of which set of trade-offs are more preferable in the debate. Because in most debates about democratic reforms, teams have to recognize early on that they cannot solve every problem associated with democracies. For example, polarization, representation issues, inclusivity, and things like that. And like I think teams in this round tried very hard to win on every possible area of reform, which I think becomes unrealistic because democracies are fundamentally not a perfect system of governance, right? Debates about democratic reforms therefore test the teams, especially on which areas of democracies they decide that they desire to focus on more. And that's an exercise in justifying trade-offs through a lot more rigorous weighing. So picking the battles wisely during preparation time, that is to say, committing to a clear set of trade-offs that speakers can consistently justify, is the path to victory in these sorts of debates about democratic reforms. And the reason why I'm making this general comment about the strategy of the teams in this round is that I understand that both teams are trying to win on each other's grounds, but the problem with that strategy in this debate especially is that instead of making the justification for the logical hierarchy and priority of certain trade-offs in the debate, it ended up becoming a debate that had all speakers trying to win on every single area of reform. And therefore, the consequence of that was that the speeches in the round were less effective and less efficient. And that's the reason why I think the speeches also tended to overtime, because I think like most, if not all speakers in this room went past the 8-minute and 30-second mark. What I think needs to be improved on specifically moving forward is deciding in preparation time what sets of trade-offs are things that you care most about and why you care most about those things needs to come out much earlier on so that the weighing process starts earlier so that teams are not trying to directly refute each other on every single possible area of the debate. And that also consequently makes these speeches more likely to be efficient in the future. So so the verdict was as follows. The panel was unanimous. We thought that the negative team won the debate. So congratulations to Malaya 1 and commiserations to UPLB 2. So there were two main clashes in this round that were relevant for deciding who won the debate. The first was which side gets better policy making around controversial issues. And so the affirmative teams set up in this round for what this looks like is that you need better policy making to occur, you need some of these you need people to be people in power to be connected to the ground, and you need to remove the rich people's influence on controversial policies that affect the average person on the ground. And the affirmative teams argues that the politicians right now suck at policy making for controversial issues because they're politically captured by the rich, and therefore a lot of the times like campaigning, lobbying, and donations are things that they care a lot more about, and that's their path to being in power. That's how they stay in power as well, and therefore they don't feel the pressure to change whatever policies that they want, change whatever policies that the population might want to have. The other thing I think then that comes in response from this negative team to this argument or this setup is to say that there are a number of reasons why politicians actually do respond to what the population wants. The first piece of counter-characterization, I think that was probably the strongest in the round from the negative team, was that because politicians have a desire to differentiate themselves from other candidates, they tend to want to be sensitive or listening, or at least appear to listen to people for the reason that they want to compete in elections for your vote. And therefore, even if it is true that they don't have the purest of intentions, and even if they may not directly care most about like this particular minority group's interest, they tend to at least gravitate towards trying to do something about those things anyway. So I think this mitigation that the negating team did was persuasive, especially because the affirmative team's response to the negating team's argument on democratic principles was, we on the side of the affirming team, we still will have parliaments that have elected senators anyway. So like if it is true that you will still have elected senators anyway, and you're trying to co-opt that these people will continue to exist as democratic representatives anyway, then it seems persuasive that at the very least there are going to be elections that will be held that will mean that competition between politicians continues to exist. So I don't think there's a clear response to this layer of mitigation coming up from the affirming team on this particular area of exchange. The negative team then forwards a number of claims for why the citizens' assemblies are terrible. And I guess the affirming team also has some responses to it too. Let's talk about that now. So some of the things that were being said about citizens' assemblies were that biases were likely to exist because of racist or xenophobic tendencies that exist in the population, and also like individual preferences are actually quite varied across the population. I don't think there was I think the panel unanimously agreed that there was no clear response to the idea of like how individual preferences are going to continue to exist in a wildly varied form. It wasn't just like a simple median or average set of preferences that would eventuate on the affirmative side. So it's unclear how that aggregation towards the average set of preferences was likely. It's unclear how the affirming team was able to illustrate how that would necessarily come about. But secondly, I would point out that the claim that I think the negating team makes here is that biases existing on both sides anyway seems to just hold true for the purposes of this round in the way that they describe. The negative team also then points out that because of those biases, your polarization problem probably isn't necessarily solved. You probably are more likely to see gridlock reflected there as well. The thing here is that I think this does eat into a bit of the analysis for like referendums as well. It's unclear why referendums would be any better in this case, but the reason why the negating team, the reason why this isn't as damaging to the negating team is because like in this motion, like they don't have this particular debate, they didn't have a burden to necessarily prove why all these things are going to be better. They just need to prove that you might achieve some symmetry of benefits and harms for either the citizen assemblies models or the referendum model. But the burden is on the affirming team in this debate to prove that there is a marginal or significant set of benefits that make it outweigh the alternatives, such as in this case like referenda. So like even though the negating team isn't able to constructively prove mechanistically why you have all these particular benefits from referenda, and that's significantly better. I think what they're able to do there is to challenge the exclusivity of the benefits associated with the citizens' assembly and proving that asymmetry of benefits existed in relation to things like alternatives like referendums. So like, I think that's one of the ways that they are able to kind of like sidestep some of these particular claims. The other thing I think that is brought up in this round is the comparison around the undue influence of citizen assemblies. So on one hand, the affirmative case is that the rich people have an undue influence on decision-making right now on status quo. And that this is less preferable because the policies affect the average person on the ground. But this is uncomparative to the incentives that we outlined earlier that negative team already brought up, which was that there's an incentive for politicians to actually respond to the average person's needs in wanting to set themselves apart from their rivals. The other exchange that happened under this clash included things like the utilization of information. So on one hand, there was this idea of like how much you need to dumb down the information versus how much can the average person necessarily digest long-form information, and whether or not they had the ability to translate that knowledge into implemented solutions and policies. And here's, I think, quite I guess, robust exchange. The affirmative team says that there's a tension in the negative side because they say that dumbing down knowledge is insulting, but in first negative, they say that they can't use that information meaningfully. And so like it's one or the other. I don't think there's a tension here, and the reason for that is because the second negative speaker's response was a bit misinterpreted here. The second negative's response was dumbing down knowledge is a disservice to democratic decision making because it's not good information. It still creates poor outcomes, and that I think was what the negating team's response was. Not that it's insulting to the democratic decision-making framework. And I think, so I don't think that tension necessarily is damaging for the negating team. But what I will point out is that the affirming team proves that, like it's just true that the citizens are able to better understand certain events on the ground, and they are able to bring to the table a different way of explaining problems, for example, involving consent, for example. And I think the negating team doesn't directly respond to this, actually. They don't quite challenge, I think, or they don't explicitly challenge the idea that citizens' assemblies are able to basically, I guess, do things, speak in a different way or process things in a different language in their minds and implement policies in a certain way. I think what the negative team, however, is able to do, and that what their case does, is that it implicitly responds to this argument here, because it points out that, firstly, like there is, like these particular citizens probably do not have the ability to understand how to translate the information and their understanding of how bad things are into solutions. And I think this is where the question of short-term, long-term incentives became relevant. So affirmative bites the bullet and says that even if short-term incentives are acted upon by this particular citizens' assembly, this is fine, because at the end of the day, it's fair, because people want to solve urgent problems right now. But the negating team says that this response isn't good enough because you need a balance of long-term and short-term incentives so that you're able to solve problems like poverty through structural ways in the long term, for like reforming accessibility to education, rather than giving things like immediate welfare. I don't think there was a response from the affirming side that was able to overcome this challenge from the negating team. The negating team then says, I guess, like, well, citizens' assemblies also suck because call-outs won't work. I'm not sure why this is true. And like this is true. It seems intuitively true that you can still call out the citizens' assemblies if you don't like them. But what I think is the more valuable response in this round is the idea that you are able to, on negating side's response here, which was that you can use the voting mechanism to vote people out versus the random lottery system of the affirming side. I think functions as a more powerful challenge towards the accountability of the process going behind the policy making in the affirmative world. So on that basis, I think the mechanisms behind affirming the affirming side's policy seems to suggest that they are able to get, yes, some degree of median representation, but I don't think that there's a conclusive impacting done or any mechanistic work that's able to persist at the end of this debate to show that you are able to get those better policy outcomes at the end of the day on the affirming side. So the second clash, which model is more democratic? So under this clash, there was this question of like representation and accountability, which side's better. So I think how this clash plays out is a couple of things. The first thing is the way this motion, like the reason why I thought this clash was less important also was because it seems that both teams on both worlds will have some level of voting, because the affirming side points out that they will still continue to have parliaments voted in with senators. So if voting still exists on either side, then parliament will just make decisions on non-controversial issues. That seems to be what the affirming side is standing for. But if that's the case, then it feels like the clash on like whether or not there's enough like representation and things like that feels less important than the pragmatic side of the debate on policy making. So that's the reason why I prioritize policy making as a clash in this round. But the second thing I would point out here is that I think the way that the negating side is able to challenge the exclusivity of representation as a principle on the side of the affirming team is to point out that look at referendums. The response we get from the affirmative team is that there's a tension here because you guys say that citizens can't make good decisions, but you guys also stand for referendums. I think that's probably not a tension in that it seems like it's an even if rather than a carte blanche, we hate referendums, and we think citizens are stupid and they can't make good decisions. It's a response. It's used as a response to the affirming team's case as clarified by the second and third speakers of the negating side. And I think this is how like negative also co-opts representation, because they point out that the status quo does have mechanisms that are able to forward some degree of protection for representation of views in society. And I think that's how the representation principle kind of goes towards the side of the negating team. The other part on accountability, I think, was one also because they were able to, the negating team was able to prove that the random system seemed to be less accountable or responsive towards what people wanted or needed, versus like the need for politicians to campaign, to get elected, to appear like they care about citizens and being involved in that process. I was more convinced at the end of this clash that accountability principle was more likely to be upheld by the side of the negating team. So conclusion, the reason why the affirming team lost the round was because the ability for them to prove that they have diversity or some level of representation was not necessarily fully mechanized into how they were able to translate all that knowledge potentially into a set of clear policy outcomes. And I think this was a lack of illustration that I think was more to the detriment of the affirming side at the end of this round. So that's the reason why the decision was as follows. Yeah.